Hello and welcome to this discussion with Dr. Benedict Beckeld. We're very pleased to have you today on our show. And Dr. Benedict Beckeld has a PhD in classical philology and philosophy from the University of Heidelberg. He has written articles in magazines like Quillette, The American Conservative, City Journal, and the Federalist. Lately, Dr. Benedict Beckeld published a book called Oikophobia, Western Self-Contempt, Oikophobia, and the Decline of Western Civilizations. And this book has been, I must say, I really enjoyed that book. And many people enjoyed it. In Woke Watch Canada, you will see that it is part of the Forbidden Library. So if you go on the Substack for Woke Watch Canada, you will see that it has been recognized as a major book of the later years, especially with respect to talking about the anti-woke stuff and diagnosis of cultural, let's say, diseases or cultural disintegration. Is that a fair way of putting it, or do you think I'm...
No, I think that is a fair way of putting it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Right. So let me just say that the book has been praised by Sir Roger Scruton, who said, a convincingly and clearly written survey of a phenomenon that we all need to understand if we are to face the future with any confidence. This is high praise from Sir Roger. And Victor Davis Hanson has written, a timely, astute, and now much needed historical, social, economic, and psychological analysis of why Western societies are not just self-critical, but ultimately can become self-loathing. From the Greeks' warnings that with material progress comes moral regress, to the contemporary French postmodernist perversion of language, Benedict Beckeld both warns and shows that hating what made you free, secure, and prosperous is not merely decadent, but also suicidal. For those who are interested in following Dr. Benedict Beckeld, you can find him on Twitter and on YouTube with accounts that have your name, Benedict Beckeld. Mm-hmm. Okay, so some time ago, I think roughly 3 weeks ago, we released a symposium video on Oikophobia. It was Symposium 15, where we talked with Carl about Western self-contempt. And we used your book as a major springboard for discussion there. I think today we should focus more on the book, and it's good to have the author who wrote it and ask you questions about it. So, one thing, I must say that this was a very dense book, and I really enjoyed that because it was completely unlike the books I read when I was in my analytic philosophy days some months ago, for years. And I want to say that it was refreshing because it seemed to me that in this book, you talked about Western civilization, and not just Western civilization, but you talked about, let's say, a whole culture and cultural issues instead of focusing on very minute details, on a very small asterisk of a paragraph of an argument that has been written. So to me, that was a breath of fresh air, because in the academia I was used to and be a member of, and I was a member of, we operated completely differently. We would be expected to read, for instance, 300-400 papers per year that were all about the one topic. And if it wasn't just that, and if we did not do that, someone else would, the other person would be published, and we would lose the position. So it seems to me that you're offering something that is needed, and something that is more that is approximating what true philosophy is supposed to be about.
Well, thank you. That's a high compliment. Your description of your academic experience mirrors mine exactly. Indeed, and this is actually part of the reason why it was difficult to get it published, because, as you say, we are expected to focus on the very minute. Yes. And so there is an almost inherent resistance to this kind of project in academia, where you have to make some sweeping generalizations. The topic almost requires sweeping generalizations to some extent. I mean, I go into detail as well, of course, but we are encouraged, or discouraged rather, to do such things, because academic specialists, of course, always want to point out all the little exceptions and so on. And the exceptions can be important, but they preclude us from also considering the larger picture. So that's what I try to do in the book, yeah.
Right. So that was good. And I wanted to ask you whether in the University of Heidelberg there was something that pushed you towards developing a more broader perspective, because the thing is that, to my mind, there is a sort of distinction between analytic and continental philosophy departments. I don't think that necessarily there is no overlap between the themes. I think that there is. But it seems to me that the departments in academia operate very much under the spirit of that distinction. And they're very frequent, and members of them, especially let's say the bureaucratic members of them, they either identify as members of, let's say, the analytic school, and they shun continental stuff, or vice versa. So in the department I was, it was very analytic philosophy. And I remember where, for instance, I was saying that, well, the way that academia is structured, you cannot get an Aristotle. You cannot get, for instance, a Bernard Williams. If all the focus is on throwing small stones, you cannot basically be led into a position where people cultivate that holistic, let's say, perspective that seems to me to be associated with philosophers and cultural critics of note. Mm-hmm. And I was saying that this is not the way to go forward. The Aristotle of our times is going to try to lift a heavy boulder all at once. It's going to be messy. It's not going to be perfect, but it's definitely not going to be the minute analytic way. So I wanted to ask you if you think that what was your experience in the University of Heidelberg, and whether there was the same focus on details, or there was sort of a push to developing a broader perspective?
No, not really. I mean, overall, I was reasonably happy with my time in Heidelberg, but there is definitely, as you say, the focus on minutiae. And in fact, my big problem with the philosophy department in Heidelberg was that, but I think that's true of a lot of philosophy departments around the world, was that it was not really a department of philosophy, but a department of doxography. Yeah. That is to say, it's all just a fight about what Kant said or what Hegel said. There's no discussion about whether what they're saying is actually true. One just fights about the opinions that already exist. And the philosophers nowadays sort of fight over the scraps of philosophy that already exist and argue about what somebody actually meant. But there's no effort to actually continue to philosophize beyond Kant or Hegel or whomever it may be. Yes. And so there's no drive to tackle the big questions. And so that's always been intellectually stifling. And what you said, I mean, I say also in the book myself, so what you say is music to my ears, namely that an Aristotle or a Montaigne or somebody like that is impossible today in the university. Basically, they cannot come from the training that is provided in the universities. And so if such a person is to be able to do his work, he must really do it on his own, without encouragement from the academic establishment, and that was certainly my case. So what the sort of research projects that I was doing academically had nothing to do with the subject of this book, really. Maybe a little bit peripherally, but this was basically just an entirely independent project.
Okay, that's good. So what you said about doxography, it seems to me that what is different about the difference between those who occupy an academic position and those who want to take the extra step and engage in cultural criticism and basically say something of value for now in our times, is that in academic positions, things are almost always phrased in a conditional terms. If we accept this, then this follows. If we accept that, then the other thing follows. Except when it comes to bureaucracy, then there is no conditional. Then everyone is guilty from the very beginning. But the thing is that it seems to me that when you write a book like that, you step outside this merely hypothetical realm of operation, and you take a stance on things that happen around you. And this is not something that is well received by people, both who agree, especially within an institution, and those who disagree with the direction towards which you want to direct your thought. Because it seems to me that, for instance, in academia, tell me if that was your experience, the people who agreed with me were even worse than the ones who didn't, because they felt that, well, if this person agrees with us, this person is going to get published and we're not going to seem to be making a contribution. This person, we're fishing from the same pond. So it was a catch-22. And it seems to me that from what you have said, that it was sort of a catch-22 for you as well when you published the book, because it must have been a very difficult book to publish.
Yes.
Do you want to say a bit about, was it, I'm sure it wasn't well received, because academic presses right now aren't very fond of messages like the ones you have on the book. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. I didn't. My experience, to go to your first point, wasn't maybe so much that people who agreed with me were even worse, but they certainly weren't better. Anyway, I can say. Okay. Sometimes I would get messages of private support from fellow academics who said, "Well, we agree with what you're doing," and I would usually tell them, "Well, if you're not willing to state it publicly, then it doesn't really mean anything to me because it doesn't help in any way. We have to show that there are maybe not a lot of us, but at least some of us within academia who think a particular way or who have these opinions or want to engage in larger projects. And if we state it publicly, then we make it easier for each other. So private messages of support are pretty pointless. But in terms of the publishing process, it was difficult, as you can imagine. Most academic presses would just reject it out of hand when they saw, for example, that Roger Scruton had said something positive about it, because of course that was since he passed away, I believe, in 2020. So I got his blurb, his support, by sending him an earlier draft in manuscript form to get his view and his endorsement. And so I used that, of course, his endorsement as part of the pitch. And of course, the moment people see the name Roger Scruton, they right away say, "Well, that's not for us." And yeah, which is sorry, did you want to?
No.
And so that was part of it, of course. And part of it is simply people can tell right away that if you have published something in Quillette or in the American Conservative or whatever it may be, then of course you couldn't possibly have anything of value to say. I did go through a peer review process at a different academic press first before I got to Cornell. And the anonymous peer reviews that I got back one of them was all right, but the other one basically called me a fascist. And of course, they're a little too savvy to use that precise word, but you could read between the lines is that that's what the person was saying. And so there was no attempt to engage with the arguments. They just basically said that, okay, this is garbage. And so then I was lucky. I kept searching. Then I finally came to Cornell, where I was lucky because the acquisitions editor for philosophy at Cornell happened to be a more open-minded person. Doesn't necessarily mean she agreed with everything I had to say, but she was more open-minded and was willing to take on the project. But even with Cornell, I've had great difficulty because, as I mentioned, they previously, for example, when I referred your discussion with Carl Benjamin earlier about the book, and I told them for publicity purposes that that the two of you had said some positive things about the book, which would have been a great thing because the Lotus Eaters, of course, you have a pretty high profile and you're well known. Exactly, yeah. So a little bit of flattery there, but it happens to be true. I told them that for publicity purposes, so that they could appear on Amazon and things like that, so people can see, oh, okay, the Lotus Eaters and Carl Benjamin, they've said something good about this book, so it might be interesting to buy. They refused to publicize that because they felt that Carl Benjamin was too extreme. And I tried to reason with them. Talking now about the marketing department, right? That's separate, of course, from the acquisitions department. The acquisitions department had accepted the book in the first place, but then the marketing department, who's supposed to publicize it, they thought that no, that was too extreme. We can't do that, even though it means fewer sales. And so this is one example of the sort of difficulty that I've had to deal with, not just with the publishing process, but also with the publicizing process afterwards. And
I'm sure they didn't explain what they meant by that. They just threw that word like that. Oh,
yeah, hiding behind bureaucratic niceties, basically, and saying that, well, we have to watch our brand and so on, and this, it's not going to reflect well on us and so on. But it's their decision what they want to publicize. But they would never, and that's similar to the rejections I got from a lot of philosophy presses. They're too savvy to say right out, basically, that, well, we're on the left and we don't like this sort of thing. So they'll hide behind academic and bureaucratic niceties.
And I may add, they will pretend to be in favor of free exchange of ideas.
Of course, absolutely. At the same time, so we get used to this sort of thing in academia.
Right. So let me ask you, what is the purpose of the book and what is the method that you use there? Because it seems to me that many people have misunderstood the method. And you have a video where you respond to critics on YouTube, which I watched and I really enjoyed. But do you want to share with us what is the purpose and the method that you use?
Yeah, so the purpose, it wasn't so deliberate in the sense that I set out to establish this sort of project. It sort of just came to me. I describe it actually a little bit in the beginning of the book, but it is basically just I was confronted by oikophobia as part of my daily life so often, both privately and professionally, academically. And so at some point, I just sort of threw up my arms and said, well, this is ridiculous. I have to write about this. So the purpose was simply just to sort of get out all of these thoughts that had been brewing inside. I had this moment where the whole idea of the book sort of just came to me in a bit of a flash of a moment. And so I didn't really, it wasn't a deliberate purpose. It just sort of came to me and I had to write it down. And in terms of the method, I realized that, and again, this is also part of the same answer, that it wasn't a purpose, because I didn't really do any academic research as such for the book. Because it wasn't that I sat down and said, okay, I want to write about oikophobia and history, and then I started doing research about it. Rather, the whole idea of the book sort of coalesced just from a lifetime of reading. I'm sure you know what I mean. Those of us who are bibliophiles,
it arose spontaneously. It's not something. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. If you've read good books and philosophy all of your life, then at some point this pattern just sort of emerged in my mind, and so I decided to sit down and write it out. And so the method was simply, I figured, okay, well, I can make it more convincing to the modern day if they understand that this is not some aberrant phenomenon that just fell out of the sky.
Yes.
But rather that we can explain it by, in fact, looking at the fact and realizing that it has a history.
Okay.
And so so that was basically establishing the history and then dissecting it philosophically. Yeah.
Right. So let us move to the concept of oikophobia. How exactly should we understand the concept, and how should we not understand it? And I'm asking this because very frequently it seems to me that when people introduce a concept, there are many interpretations of it, and there are better and worse interpretations. So how should we understand it, and how we should definitely not understand it as?
Well, oikophobia, the basic understanding of it should simply be that it is that cultural self-hate that it develops as a civilization has reached maturity, as a Western civilization has reached maturity, certainly, and that it is the opposite of xenophobia, that is to say, as opposed to despising or disliking or fearing foreigners, one despises or dislikes or fears one's own culture, one's own countrymen, sometimes also. That's the basic understanding of how we should understand oikophobia, and therefore understand also that it is more of a knee-jerk reaction rather than a sort of well-thought-out process. Now, there are, of course, certain oikophobes who, once they have oikophobia, develop fairly elaborate systems of thought to defend or to justify their oikophobic feelings. But the oikophobia itself is just sort of there as a knee-jerk reaction. It develops as a distaste of one's own culture. In terms of how not to understand it, I think that's the other side of the coin. One should not understand it as a very well-developed philosophy, because it's not. Because we see that oikophobia developed in history also among people who were not philosophers, who just sort of had this sort of knee-jerk reaction. And one sees it even more today than in the past, that oikophobia has become such a mass phenomenon that it's really not to be understood, at least not primarily, as a philosophical movement, but rather as a sort of
knee-jerk reaction.
Knee-jerk reaction, subculture of self-hate. Yeah.
Okay, and so is it fair to say that in an Aristotelian fashion, we could say that oikophobia and xenophobia are the two extremes, and we sort of have to find the middle way or a middle ground? Okay.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they are the two vices, and the Aristotelian golden mean is that which is in between the two. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So one thing to ask about it, because it seems to me that what you're describing is the book is a sort of theory where it doesn't seem to me that you're appealing to necessities, to appealing to necessary patterns, but it seems to me that you're appealing to strong tendencies. And this is the way also I like to think about historical events and tendencies. That when does oikophobia arise? It seems to me that in the book, you say that there is a trajectory in the history of human civilizations, and first we have the development of xenophobia and then the development of oikophobia. And it is sort of a natural process. Is that an accurate description? Do you want to add more to that and expand on it?
Yeah, so it does develop as once a society has, and you touched a little bit upon this in your conversation with Carl, that essentially oikophobia is what arises once a civilization has eliminated exterior enemies, has achieved a level of security and wealth and leisure, so that a leisure class can develop that starts focusing on the own culture's vices, as opposed to focusing on the vices of the enemy. When the enemy, the exterior enemy, is still very present, of course, one has to focus on them. Once they recede into the background, it becomes possible to focus on one's own shortcomings. And so, in that sense, oikophobia is a very natural, quote-unquote, natural thing that arises. When you talk about determinism in history and so on, that's actually why I write the epilogue in the at the end of the book to sort of address that issue. There are two. I guess you said you wanted to kind of get to that maybe a little later.
Let's leave that for the end if you want. But by all means, finish your point.
Yeah, basically, I was going to say there are two levels of there are basically two levels of discourse when it comes to this particular issue. One can have the more stringently deterministic level of discourse, which is to say, if there's no free will, then of course things just happen as they happen. But one has to be careful with that, because that can bleed into the other level of discourse, the sort of non-technical level of discourse, where people then think that, well, if there's no free will, then of course it doesn't matter what I do, and then we sort of give up in trying to improve our own societies, or to struggle against oikophobia. And of course, that's not what I'm saying. And so when we talk about tendencies, and I also criticize Marx, right, in other contexts for always using the word Gesetz, right, law, when it comes to history. Whereas we really should be speaking of tendencies, because when we speak of tendencies, we can at least, even if it's difficult, we can at least realize that it's at least possible for us to have a positive influence on the societies in which we live and to try to affect things in a good direction.
Right. I think that this is important to stress and reemphasize, because when we talk about tendencies, we are much less prone to fall into what we could say ideological ways of thinking. Now, I know that in your book, you say that right now ideology has become a dirty word. And yes. But I'll use it in that sense, in the dirty one. So right. It seems to me that the point is that when people start talking about necessities, especially in history, they seem to be buying into a mentality, or at least they frequently seem to buy into a mentality where if the facts oppose theory, so worse for the facts, because they try so much to make the theory work that they really become averse to empirical facts. Right. And even I think there have been some historians, especially I think it's E.H. Carr. I'm not certain, but I think it's E.H. Carr who is very skeptical of the use of empirical facts. But let us not talk about that. So when you talk about tendencies, it seems to me to be healthy, because there is a sort of healthy empiricist attitude, a sort of healthy doubt with respect to being happy to be proven wrong, or being at least accepting the possibility that we may be wrong, instead of just saying, okay, that's it, I have my set of generalizations, they all explain everything, everyone who speaks otherwise is, let's say, is ignorant or bad, and we either coerce them or shoot them. That there can be tyrannical tendencies when we start talking about necessities. And that is why I think that many people embrace the more empirical attitude, especially in the Anglosphere of the 20th century. Now, back to the concept of oikophobia. It seems to me to involve the idea that the ecophobe has the attitude of rejecting national loyalties. Is that an accurate way of putting it?
Yes, definitely.
So the main question here is, how do we understand national loyalties? Because I want to say the following. To my mind, it seems sort of obvious. But there is a question with respect to how the concept of oikophobia can be used in dialogue, because I was talking about this with a friend of mine who is very left-wing in Greece, and he says, but there's no such thing as oikophobia. I said, of course there is. You are the main ecophobe, the major ecophobe I know. And he was saying, no, I am in favor of the nations, just that we understand national loyalties and national interests differently. And to my mind, the way he understands it is completely mistaken. But so that is the question. How do we use the concept of oikophobia in public discussion? Is it a concept that when we use it, people who are, let's say, the ecophobes we have in mind will accept it? Or will they say, no, you have a bad idea of what national loyalties are. You have a bad and distorted idea of national interest. And so we are not against our culture. We are against some features of our culture and in favor of others. So what would you say about this? How should we react? Is it a concept that can be used only among, let's say, a particular group, or can it be used for public discussion, for the purposes of public discussion more?
Yeah. It's the reaction of your friend is interesting, because I've had similar reactions like that myself among my circle of acquaintances. People will say there's no such thing as oikophobia, similarly to how people will say there's no such thing as political correctness. And the reason they say that is because they have so internalized their own particular oikophobia and their own sense of political correctness that they're sort of assuming that that is the sort of default position that a person has. And so that's not phobic in any way. That's not politically correctness, because that's just sort of the baseline of how it's right to be. And it's anything that's different from that, that's an aberration. Yeah. And that's another reason of discussing the historical process, so that one can see that it's actually the oikophobia that is, in some sense, historically at least, an aberration. But so how to understand oikophobia and how to use it in discourse, one has to explain to people that it is an aberration. It is a decadence in the sense that I use the word in the book, in the sense that it is a falling away or a falling off from what used to be the norm in the society. So in that sense, it is an aberration, whether one agrees with it or not. It is the sense of national loyalty is, there's some people who say that nationalism and the idea of national loyalty and so on, it's a modern phenomenon. It's true to a limited extent in terms of some of the manifestations of nationalism that we have today, that they can be understood as a modern phenomenon. But the idea of belonging to a broader community is certainly ancient. There's nothing particularly modern about that. Certain ancient societies may not have had national anthems and flags the way we have them. And so because of the lack of those exterior manifestations of nationalism, people tend to think of nationalism as something purely modern. But the idea of being unified around a common language and religion and so on, and a history to some extent as well, it depends on what ancient society we're talking about.
Yes.
That as well, that is nothing particularly modern. That is a certainly ancient idea. And I think that's we have to have this sort of, if we want to properly understand what oikophobia is, we have to have this sort of broader understanding of nationalism. That is to say, not just the singing of a national anthem with a hand on the heart and so on, but in fact the rallying of a particular linguistic community around a set of accepted norms, traditions, religious practices, and so on. And that's as ancient as can be. And if we understand nationalism in that sense, then we see that oikophobia is the aberration away from that. It's the belittling of those things.
Okay, that seems to me a lot to reflect Alasdair MacIntyre's view of a community. Am I wrong?
No, there's something to that. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now, the thing is, with respect to the instrumentalization of oikophobia, it seems to me that this kind of this sentiment is somehow being instrumentalized. And what do I mean by that? And tell me if you think I'm onto something here. That if we can define oikophobia as a sort of knee-jerk reaction, as an attitude that is against, let's say, one's culture and one's civilization, and it's a sort of extreme attitude. It's the knee-jerk opposition to anything that is in favor of, let's say, one's culture. It seems to me that this is really dangerous in multicultural societies and in contemporary Western societies. And it is sort of instrumentalized by those who play into identity politics to a ridiculous extent. And what do I mean by that? It seems to me that a feature of identity politics involves a sort of several steps plan. And one involves the division of the population, or of a, let's say, significant portion of the population, into groups that are oppressed by the indigenous population. Usually it's the male native population. And it seems to me that at the moment, we have people in Western societies who are playing identity politics in the following way. They try to obfuscate the idea that the groups that they name minority groups, and the groups that they claim to represent, and the groups that they claim to want to emancipate, they are not consistent. They don't have compatible ideas of what constitutes respectful coexistence. So, for instance, I'll just going to mention a particular, let's say, conflict that we see nowadays. We have many people who are talking in favor of women's rights and other people who talk in favor of trans rights. And very frequently there is a major conflict there. And we regularly find people, I think it's on both sides of the Atlantic, we regularly find people who try to say that there is no such conflict. This conflict is only created, it's artificial. And they are trying to portray a sort of the male native population, especially, not just male, but usually it's the male native population. They try to demonize it because the only way to have, let's say, different groups together that are incompatible is to invent a common enemy. So the question is oikophobia something that is sort of brainwashed in us nowadays as a means of pacifying the majority of the population, or let's say the male native population of Western countries, into accepting an agenda that harms things like national interests and national loyalties? Yeah, or patriotism. Maybe we don't have to focus on the idea of a nation. Let's talk about patriotism if you would like. Do you think that this is a way in which oikophobia can be sort of manufactured and it can be communicated by what we would call the malicious oikophobes, the ones who are purposefully oikophobes, who and try to indoctrinate the next generation, let's say, with these ideas?
Of course, and you see that all the time. I mean, there is a common, and this is also something I address in the book, there is a common effort on the oikophobic left, especially to sort of portray everything that they don't like, everything such as patriotism and nationalism and so on, as these sort of constructs that don't really have any real existence in reality. And of course, the response to that, philosophically speaking, is that if those are constructs, and indeed they may be to some extent, then what you're doing, of course, is also a construct. And so you cannot reject something simply because it's a construct, because it's something that exists purely in our minds. If we reject things on that basis, we'd have to reject everything, philosophically speaking. And so that's not a sufficient rejection of either oikophobia or non-oikophobia. But it's certainly something that is being done very deliberately. And I mean, one sees this. I mean, I grew up in Sweden. Most of my school years were spent in Sweden. And of course, at the time, I didn't think much of it. But looking back at my childhood now as an adult, of course, I see that sort of indoctrination took place all the time. Now, there's nothing in particularly wrong, which is an important point to make, about indoctrination of school children in and of itself, because indoctrination to some extent must always take place. There is no such thing, and this is again people who attack my point of view as a construct, this is what they don't understand, namely that everything we do is a construct. There's no such thing as quote unquote pure unvarnished truth, right? When we present something to school children or to university students for that matter, we always must present it through an interpretative lens, right? Because there's no such thing as a quote unquote pure truth independently of human communication. And so when we communicate something, a quote unquote truth to somebody else, it always takes place through an interpretive lens. And so certainly in the socio-humane sciences. And so the idea in and of itself that we must present a certain set of ideas to school children as preferable to another set of ideas, that's unremarkable. I think that's something that must always take place. Yeah. But this also means the flip side of the coin is that when we present a more oikophobic set of ideas to the school children, that is not the sort of baseline of truth. That is a construct. That is an interpretation of the truth, an interpretation of history and so on, and an interpretation that, in my opinion, is very noxious and very bad for society and for the school children, because they get a very warped, I think even more warped view of history than they would otherwise have. And so I think most certainly it's subtle sometimes, but it's a very real indoctrination. I remember some of the songs that that I sang as a school child in Sweden, and looking back at the lyrics now, I realized, oh, that was pure socialist propaganda. Of course it was, and the same goes for oikophobia and much else. Yeah.
Right. I just had an idea whether we should talk about the dimensions in which oikophobia and xenophobia appear, because it seems to me that right now, the people who actively push in favor of fostering oikophobia in the majority of the population, at least the native population of Western countries, in a sense, they are xenophobes. What do I mean by that? It seems to me that xenophobia is frequently a notion that occurs when we are talking about people of different cultures. When we have culture A and culture B, and it concerns how members of culture A feel about members of culture B. But when we have people within the culture, when we have groups, it seems to me that we could also think of this in terms of groups. So would you say that at the moment, we could say something like the following, that the people who are pushing forward the identity politics agenda are winning ground, or that at least they feel they're winning ground. As they feel that they're winning ground, they are so much focused on the enemy and manufacturing the enemy that they are xenophobes, not in the sense of people of different cultures, people of different groups. So would you say that in that respect, cultural oikophobes are internal cultural xenophobes, in the sense that they're they're contemptuous of other people of their own culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting way of looking at it. Certainly, I mean, why not? I think it's a good interpretative turn of the word.
Maneuver, let's say.
Yeah, exactly. Maneuver, exactly. It's true that group identity, of course. And this is, I don't look at the word xenophobia in this way, as you just did, but in the book, I do talk about how the sort of neo-tribalism occurs. Yeah. You have a more holistic tribalism early on in the society, when the entire society is sort of one tribe, as against other societies, other tribes, quote unquote. But in the neo-tribalism, we have smaller tribelets within the larger society. And so if a member of a society is a xenophobe against the members of another society, then indeed, as you say, one could extend that and say that, well, if tribalism is a sort of xenophobia, then yes, then within particular tribelets of one larger society, a sort of mini xenophobia, or xenophobia on a lower level, if you will, can develop toward other groups, toward other tribelets of that society. That's certainly true. And one sees, of course, that the hostility that exists between smaller groups of the same society, certainly here in the United States, but I know the same to be true in certain European countries, although it's right now for a variety of reasons, it's a little more intense here in the United States. But one sees that the hatred that these groups have for each other is much greater than the hatred that any of them have for foreigners, which is not to say that it would be better and they would compensate for things if they also started hating foreigners. But it is to say that something has gone terribly wrong when members of the same society who share the same history and the same language and so on, when they start hating each other so much, one understands that something has definitely gone awry, and so, as you say, that could be understood as a sort of xenophobia. Yeah.
Right. So let's talk a bit about the manifestations of icophobia. It seems to me that in your book you say that there are two major manifestations of icophobia.
Yes.
It's moral relativism and positivism, and you devote a chapter respectively for each.
Yes.
Do you want to say a bit more about how you understand moral relativism as a sort of manifestation of icophobia, and that explain how also positivism is a form of icophobia?
Yeah, so it's mostly about, and this was I think one area in your discussion with Carl, which I watched with great interest and which I really enjoyed.
Thank you.
Where absolutely, where there was maybe a little bit of a disagreement. So relativism is not. Relativism doesn't lead to oikophobia, just like positivism doesn't lead to oikophobia. But as you say, it's an expression of oikophobia. And historically speaking, and that's why I talk about relativism first in the book. Historically speaking, relativism appears as a vehicle, you might say, of oikophobia before positivism serves that function. And if you look at it historically, the first appearances of oikophobia in ancient Athens tend to go hand in hand with relativist philosophies that developed at the time in late 5th century and early 4th century BC.
Yeah.
So oikophobia does not have to be relativistic, but one can see that it's easy for relativism and oikophobia to go hand in hand.
Yes, okay, I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, because if you're going to reject your own culture and look down at your own traditions, an easy way of doing that, of course, is to say that what we believe is true is not really, has no claim to universality. There's nothing special about it. What these other people think is just as valid, if not better. And so relativism becomes that hook upon which oikophobia can sort of attach itself. And then positivism appears later on. But yeah, I would say it's a manifestation of oikophobia, and one that doesn't require a lot of intellectual effort. I think that's another important point to make. There are, of course, certain relativist philosophers who are very intellectually rigorous in their relativism. So I'm not saying that it's impossible to be a relativist and intellectually rigorous at the same time. But for most people, and when we're talking about oikophobia as a mass phenomenon, of course, we're talking about most people, relativism does not require a lot of intellectual effort. Instead of having to defend to figure out why this particular set of ideas is better than that, it's quite easy to just say, well, it's all equal. It's just a matter of what you think. And so that's why relativism is an easy temptation into oikophobia.
So one question here, because maybe I use the concept in a more technical sense, but to my mind, moral relativism isn't necessarily what you're describing, because it is a sort of position that does involve thought about what is right or wrong. So it's not it's not the kind of relativism that you would say first-year undergraduates have, that, who are you to say? It's from your perspective, or it's from our perspective. So it seems to me that very frequently moral relativism is conflated with the attitude of tolerance. Now, they're compatible, but I don't think that they must be compatible, because moral relativism seems to me to be we could say, a morally realist position, a position that does affirm what is morally right, that moral facts exist. But unlike objectivists, for instance, they would say that these facts are not out there for everyone, applying universally and necessarily everywhere. They are relative to particular culture. And someone who would say they are relative to a particular person, that would be a moral subjectivist. So it seems to me that we can have relativists who are not ecophobes, in the sense that they say that, okay, I may not be objectively right in what I'm doing, but I am right, and these are the customs of my country or my community, and I will act accordingly. So, right. But to be fair, you did say that you don't think that they are one and the same.
No, and
Yeah.
here is the distinction I make between moral and cultural relativism quite important. I recall you said you weren't quite happy with the distinction in the way I made it, but basically, cultural relativism, as I use it in the book, is precisely as you say, right? It does not have to entail one can still have this position that, okay, I understand that the morals that I have are contingent upon my culture.
Yeah.
But within that framework, I think that this is best, and this other moral set is worse.
Okay.
So that's certainly not oikophobic. Moral relativism, on the other hand, comes much closer to subjectivism, as you describe it, because if you have moral relativism, then you're no longer saying that, well, I accept the moral principles of my culture, even if I don't think they have universal application. But if you're a moral relativist as opposed to a cultural relativist, you're saying that no particular moral set or particular value has any meaning at all, regardless of culture. And so that can be used overlappingly with subjectivism, and it is in some of the philosophical literature. This type of relativism and subjectivism are basically used interchangeably. It depends on the author, admittedly, but so I use it in that sense. And so when you say that it's more like subjectivism, I agree. But it's when it comes to moral relativism, that is pretty much the same as subjectivism as I use it. But
Fair
cultural
point.
relativism, I agree. And cultural relativism is pretty much something in that sense. When you describe it as a morally realist position, it certainly can be. And that's happens to be not very far from what I think myself. But yeah, so one of them is more oikophobic than the other, which is why I'm at pains to point. Maybe I should have put it in the main text and not just in the footnote. But that moral relativism is what I'm talking about, even though it might sound sometimes like cultural relativism. So
I don't want to sound unfair, because it seems to me that the point definitely applies to Western cultures that are, we would say, a bit more tolerant than some other cultures, because it seems to me that what is particularly problematic about the kind of relativism that you're talking about and we are talking about is the idea that there is a lack of commitment to some moral values, and frequently it comes with a sort of intellectual laziness, because it is frequently associated with the idea that we shouldn't judge. Right. So it seems to me to be there seems to me to be an attitude there that is distinct from the doctrine, just like with oikophobia, where you said that there are. So so it's a fair point. Now,
because we're talking about the mass of most people, right? Not academic philosophers, as you say, and this sort of general sentiment that exists in the populace at large is indeed is more in that direction.
And we could still say that there could be relativists in Western society whose customs involve a substantial amount of tolerance, who would be tolerant to a, let's say, ridiculous extent. Right. That may be an implication. Now, with respect to positivism, I was a bit uncertain the first time I read the chapter, and I'm still not confident that I understood exactly what you said, but tell me if I'm wrong. You mentioned Francis Bacon's Oceania? Yep.
Atlantis.
Sorry. Is Oceania by Thomas More? Yes, I think so. So you mentioned Francis Bacon and his sort of utopian aspiration to use science into sort of reform society to such a radical extent where you could say that human sensibility would be so much reformed that there would be a utopia and there would be zero problems anymore. Is this how the oikophobe is using positivism, or have I misunderstood it?
No, that's pretty much it. And of course, and this is what I talk about then later in the book, is that will come to conflict with relativism. And even though one will see the two exist side by side in the same person. But yes, that's essentially what positivism is. Now, they might not always express it in that way. Of course, somewhat intellectually savvier positivists will, of course, not use the word utopia generally, because that's a sort of discredited word for good reason. But the sort of that general feeling, they have that feeling in their hearts, if not the thought in their brains, that yes, indeed, things can approach a more utopian state. and that invariably involves the erasure of whatever is special about us, so that we can all meld into one large human community.
Yeah. So, question now. I don't get the impression that you think that ecophobia is the only problem that afflicts Western societies.
No.
That would be a bad interpretation and a very uncharitable one. But given the fact that it is a bad one, how big of a problem do you think it is? And how do you think we can react against it, if not solve it entirely? Because I think that you do write in the book that this arises naturally once societies reach a particular level of affluence, that it does arise. So I'm not talking about the ultimate triumph over evil. I'm talking about how to react against ecophobia, and to what extent is it a problem?
Yeah, the extent to which it's a problem is could be a whole conversation in and of itself. I mean, it weakens societies internally. Now, if all societies, if all nations in the world were reasonably benevolent Western liberal democracies, then oikophobia would probably not be such a big problem. Yeah. But because there are nations like Russia and China and so on, North Korea, etc., the list is long, because those things exist, when the West weakens itself internally, of course, that is bad for the world as a whole. And so for that reason, oikophobia is bad, not just from a cultural point of view, in the sense that we reject our own history, we reject the artwork of our own traditions and so on, which is bad enough. But it's also bad in the sense that, well, if we don't want to stand up anymore for what we believe because we've stopped believing those things, that, of course, leaves the room open on a geopolitical level for nations that do still believe in certain things, but whose beliefs might be a bit more dangerous than those that we have ourselves. So in terms of how bad oikophobia is, it can almost not be overstated how dangerous oikophobia can be to a society. And nowadays, not so much maybe to ancient Athens, but now when the whole world is interconnected, it can certainly be very bad for the entire world. In terms of what to do against it, I mean, the sort of conversation we're having right now is sort of a thing that one needs to do, and sort of alert people to the fact that this is an aberration, to alert people to the fact through historical education that this is not the normal state of affairs. And of course, I mean, people know that the problem is that when people reject their history, they think that that the opposite of oikophobia, that xenophobia and oppression and cruelty and slavery and all of those things were all that there was to the past. And of course, part of educational instruction is also of historical instruction is also to make people understand that that's not the case. But yeah, as you could probably tell from the book, I am not particularly sanguine about our progress on this front. And the sort of cliched answer that, well, we just need more education and better education, that won't really cut it, because
what kind of education?
What kind of education, precisely? And generally, the problem is that the more educated people become, the more oikophobic they tend to become. Now, there is such a thing as being very, very educated, in which case that could be an antidote to oikophobia. But the thing is, that very high level of education, which only the fewest people have nowadays, cannot be attained on a mass level through our educational institutions.
And sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, there is a saying that we have in Greece, I don't know exactly if it's going to be translated well, that half knowledge is worse than no knowledge at all.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's very true.
Because it breeds a kind of conceit. And it seems to me that this kind of conceit is a really widespread attitude in civilizations who have reached, let's say, the zenith of their power. And it breeds a kind of exceptionalism, very frequently, that is associated with power and the projection of might in the geopolitical sphere. But it also breeds into a sort of really weird thing to look at, because it seems to me that when I hear ecophobes speak, they speak as if other people have no agency. And other members of other cultures have no agency. So it seems to me, they are so much preoccupied with winning the identity politics culture war within their own country, or their respective countries, that anything that happens anywhere in the world, they immediately portray as sort of a bad outcome of Western influence, or a bad outcome of American influence, English influence, French influence, whatever. There's so much. And this seems to me to be exactly the problem with half knowledge, as you're saying, or the increase of education, because, okay, we're not, when we're talking about increasing education, we don't actually accept, we don't breed the God's eye point of view to people. We just give them frequently more information. Right. And unless there is a sort of connection between all of what is being taught, we're not really talking about education in the classical sense. We're talking about the reception of increasingly more information. So I wonder whether you would say that ecophobes are conceited, and to what extent do they represent worse what they are detracting? Because it seems to me that very frequently ecophobes are way more conceited than the fellow members of their population, as they decry the fellow members of the population to be. So they would frequently say, for instance, in, let's say, Western countries at the moment, you Western people, you don't have, you're blind to your own class prejudice, you're blind to your prejudices, and, you're conceited because you're blind to your prejudices, yada, yada, yada. But they seem to be way more conceited in that they literally cannot conceive of the idea of the agency of other people. And we see it regularly on the news every day, with the intensity of the spread and the ecophobic message and the ridiculousness of it. Would you say that this is...
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that is, I have a 10-point list in the book about why intellectuals are the ones who tend to be the most treasonous and the most oikophobic. And that is that conceitedness. Now, the thing is, the point about education, if one is truly, truly educated, if one is a genuine expert, that tends to, the old saying, which is true, that the more you know how little you know. That's definitely true. And so if one is truly educated, if one is a person who spends one's entire life reading books and engages in a lifetime of study, then that can lead to a certain humility might be too strong a word, but a certain one becomes full of awe of the knowledge of the past and the efforts, and one realizes how much there is, how little one knows, and how much greatness has been accomplished in the past. But that's a level of education that's unattainable for the vast majority of human beings. And also when we speak about educated people today, this is a point I've made elsewhere, most educated people today would be a joke compared to educated people 100 years ago. When we say somebody's educated today, they couldn't hold a candle to somebody who was considered educated 100 years ago, certainly in the humane sciences, with some very few exceptions. And so this sort of half education, as you say, one has learned enough to know that bad things happened in the past, and to know that the history of one's nation isn't as glorious as maybe it's sometimes cracked up to be. But one does not know enough to know that, to appreciate, one does not know enough to appreciate the accomplishments of the past, and one does not know enough to know that that we are a fallen species, that the sort of vices that we have in our past are common to all of humanity. Right. And so that there's no particular reason to reject just our civilization for those vices, then you'd have to reject all civilizations. And so we have this, and this is another thing I also talk about in the book, this illusion of expertise. The democratization of knowledge through the internet and earlier through the printing press and so on leads common people who are not very educated to think that they're very educated. And you see this, of course, on social media. You can look at Twitter or Facebook for about 2 seconds, and you see people talking with great earnestness about things of which they have not the slightest inkling.
The one-eyed rules the blind.
Yes, exactly, and that leads to this conceit, as you say, because one thinks one is educated and has the authority, the intellectual authority to reject one's own culture, and so that's why. But we cannot go beyond, on a mass level. We can't get beyond that level of education, and so that's why, in improving instruction in school and so on. Sure, it's a part of it, emphasizing the accomplishments of the past, the art of the past, and so on. Of course, those are all good things. But that's not going to be enough to really raise people above that level of conceit and make them understand that rejecting one's own culture because of universal human vices is a fool's errand. And so emphasizing somewhat more parochial things, if you will, like family, tradition, and so on. Those are actually better ways of combating oikophobia than simply education.
Right.
I would say.
And let me ask you the following question: what do you think will? Okay, that's very broad, but what do you think will happen in the Western world in the next 100 years? Do you think that, for instance, problems such as the demographic problem are going to be the tombstone of the Western world, or do you think that there is a way of mitigating the problems with it? And I'm saying this because, for instance, to my mind, the demographic problem is a boogeyman. Excuse me, I don't mean that it is. It doesn't exist.
Right.
I want to say that it is a scary being that has to be contended with.
Right.
Maybe that was the wrong expression, but
no, I understand.
It seems to me that we have rapidly declining birth rates.
Right.
In Greece, for instance, it's 1.34, where the replacement rate is about 2.1, I think. Mm-hmm. So that's incredibly ominous if someone cares about his or her country. And it seems to me that there is such a trend. And I don't know if it was also Polybius, the historian, who mentioned that a sort of wealth also contributes to a sort of demographic problem, because when people have more free time and more luxury, they tend to focus less on the family and more on themselves. So do you think that there is hope with respect to the Western world, or do you think that the Western world will ultimately turn its back on the family for the pursuit of material prosperity? Because it seems to me that this is a very major conversation, especially in the conservative side, that many people are not having, with respect to how boomer conservatives will talk to younger generation conservatives. And I really I don't know what the prospects of optimism are here. So what would you say about this? Do you think that ultimately, is that a contradiction in Western societies, that they are so much geared onto the pursuit of material prosperity that this will end up tramping the family, or not?
Yeah, I hope you have another question after this, because otherwise we'll have to end on a rather sad note. But
I have about free will and moral responsibility. And
Right. Okay. So I'm not very sanguine here either. Excuse me. When I first came to this country, we actually, the United States, had an above replacement birth rate, I believe, if I remember correctly. And I was shocked, actually, when I saw the most recent figures on that and saw how much it has declined in just a couple of decades. But it's interesting to compare intra-Western societies in this regard, because then one can see what elements contribute to higher birth rates. So, for example, in Israel, they have a much higher birth rate. We could still consider Israel a Western society. In Israel, the birth rate is much higher than in Western Europe, and even than here in the United States. The United States is doing better than a lot of West European countries, certainly like Greece and Italy, as you say. But one can look at what is it that Israel has that we don't have, and of course, part of the answer to that is a somewhat more parochial culture. Now, Israel is largely a secular society, but there is still a stronger presence of religion. One sees it present, both very profoundly and also even superficially in Israel. And of course, they're surrounded by enemies. That helps as well. Now, of course, we don't wish to be surrounded by enemies. That's not an optimal solution. But we see what the things are that help with the demographic problem. And so the solution will probably be cyclical, in the sense that things will continue to get worse before they get better. And after a while, things might get so bad that it will lead to real geopolitical problems. And that is the sort of thing that can relaunch a cycle and make things better again. And one sees parochial traditions, religious ceremonies, emphasis on the family, and so on. They come in moments, of course, of difficulty. One sees right after 9/11, for example, here in the United States, church attendance shot up, right, suddenly. Yeah. Then, of course, it started to ebb away again. but one sees that when a society faces adversity, those things are strengthened. Now, of course, it's not ideal to solve the problem of oikophobia through some major conflagration. Of course, nobody wants that. But those are the things that I think might help the West embrace its traditions again and to stave off the demographic decline. As things are right now, I don't really see much of a solution, quite frankly, because as you say, and Polybius is great on this. I mean, he about this cycles of civilizations and so on. I don't see much of a solution as things currently stand to the demographic problem. I think people will continue to have fewer children, unfortunately.
I think the only room for optimism here is to note that many demographic predictions have been falsified. So yes. In the spirit of falsification and fallibilism, let's hope that they are going to be...
Certainly in the opposite side of the coin, right? The Malthusian side, of course, where they think we're all going to explode with the people. Of course, that has been proven false time and again.
Yeah.
Let's hope that the other side of the coin is false as well.
Right. So let us end with the following topic. Talk a bit about free will and moral responsibility. Now, yes. The thing is, it seems to me that in the epilogue, you have a really good history of ideas of how the concept developed. And I was really happy when I saw Alexander of Aphrodisias being referred to as a milestone in the development of the concept. Now, I must say that I don't find the concept senseless. And I definitely understand that you may find it. And to make matters easy, I think that it ultimately boils down to several starting points that people take for granted. So for instance, if people take for granted the idea that every action needs to have a sufficient reason as to why it was performed rather than any other action, yes, then free will does make no sense. But I don't think that this is a sort of thing that everyone should accept. But let us focus on...
But I agree with that. I don't think it's something that everyone should accept. And when I write... I mean, I don't say it in the book because... ultimately, I'm not a politician, I'm a philosopher. So my job, as I see it anyway, is to simply tell the truth, as close to the truth anyway as I'm able to get, and not to tell people what is sort of useful or practical or convenient or sounds nice to hear. Okay. And so that's why I don't really make that point. But I agree with you that it's not something that most people should think, yeah.
Okay, I understand this, but I would not be considering myself to be saying, for instance, that I'm telling people what they want to hear. If I tell them that, for instance, I'm in favor of free will and the idea of moral responsibility, because for many people, this is a really problematic thing to hear.
Right, but those are two different things, right? Free will and moral responsibility, which is a distinction I make in the epilogue. But yeah, sure.
No, I'm not saying that you're conflating them. But let us focus on the cultural issue, and we could perhaps talk another time about the philosophical one. Sure. Let us focus on the cultural one, so the audience is a bit more interested in it. So I think that there is an issue with denying free will, and there is a sort of problem with moral responsibility if we do it. And one thing is that it seems to me that one of the major problems, or at least cultural problems of Western society, is the sort of predominance, the intellectual orthodoxy in, let's say, intellectual circles of scientific reductionism. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that ever since the 1600s, this kind of mechanistic view of the human mind and of mechanistic view of human beings has been accepted as sort of, obviously true. And people have sort of come to accept it even implicitly. And it seems to me that there's a big question of how to integrate morality into such a world, because there's, of course, Hume's famous is-ought distinction, is-ought gap. And there is a really good question that Hume raises, that how is it from a world of physical facts that we can sort of derive normative properties? And it seems to me that the more time goes by, and the more our societies become mechanized, and you could say that they are geared on this idea of efficiency especially, most people tend to accept, at least implicitly, this idea that we are machines. And of course, when intellectual, let's say, ideas become published, they don't instantly affect society, but people have started accepting, for instance, Freudian psychology as a sort of implicit truth. So it seems to me that one of the major problems in Western society is that people implicitly think that morality is just a fiction we tell ourselves so we can just feel good about ourselves when we perform some actions. Also, it's a tool that we use to manipulate other people, and that it's deep down, it's a mistake and it's a myth, and deep down we are just meat machines. So it seems to me that this is a problematic paradigm, and I wouldn't embrace it. I'm not saying that you do, but I would like to say it seems to me that in order to affirm a position that requires and embraces moral responsibility, it seems to me that we need to think of ourselves in radically different ways than the ways that are consistent with that kind of scientific reductionist orthodoxy.
Yes, and I mean, as you say, when we speak of it culturally as opposed to philosophically, I think you're right. A purely philosophical conversation would have me give a slightly different answer, but as you say, we can leave that maybe for another time.
Okay.
Or we could do it now if you want. But the thing is, the mechanistic explanation of the universe is I'm not actually hostile to the mechanistic explanation. However, and as you can see, I mean, I flatly deny the existence of free will in the epilogue. But the reason why one has to be careful about that is precisely the cultural reason, which is the one that you want to emphasize. The problem is that people apply it unevenly. So
Okay.
when people talk about morality as a construct and when people embrace the mechanistic explanation of the universe and of our actions and therefore liberate people from their moral responsibility, they apply that unevenly. People aren't rigorous in their thinking. As you said before, a lot of oikophobes take away agency from particular groups. And so in those particular cases, they subscribe to the mechanistic version of the universe, but they don't do it in their own case.
Yes.
They only do it when it's politically convenient. And so it's true that way of looking at the world has wrought certain damage, but not entirely because of the view itself, but because it's applied unevenly by political opportunists, I would say. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so it seems to me that this is a pragmatic consideration.
Yes.
And not necessarily a consideration that speaks against moralizing, because it seems to me that where it boils down to moralizing and the attitude of you. It seems to me that you are mentioning something like moral fanaticism, the kind of moral dogmatism that is extreme, is associated with intolerance, and that it leads people like ecophobes to apply it selectively. And they say, no, only those who are to be demonized by my doctrine should have moral responsibility, and they are uniformly guilty, and my people are uniformly good, for instance, and everything that they do. Yes. Okay. No, I think that I do take issue with this, and I do think that this is a very mistaken point this is a very mistaken and corrosive attitude. But I don't think that the attitude to this is to stop moralizing, but moralizing in a different way. Do you think
absolutely? No, I absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And the thing is, even within the mechanistic view of the universe, but this is where a lot of people have difficulty wrapping their head around it. But even within such a view, moralizing is not obviated by such a thing. And this is something where the postmodernists go wrong. For example, if you say that everything is about power, right, and it's also something I talk about in the book, and I remember Carl mentioned it a little bit in the I think in the conversation with you as well. If everything is about power or everything is mechanistic, that's fine, but that still doesn't mean that within that nexus of power and a mechanistic view of the universe, that everything is morally the same. One can take that view of the world, and one can say that, yes, ultimately everything is about power, and I think you made that point in the conversation. Nonetheless, certain uses of that power are better than others. And this maybe goes back a little bit to cultural relativism that we talked about earlier. Even if we say that there is no moral set that has universal application or that exists on a sort of metaphysical level, nonetheless, one can say that in our current reality as it is right now, in this place in the world and in this juncture of our history, this moral set is better than that.
Okay.
And yeah.
Now,
and so I don't think, and so I wouldn't say that the mechanistic view of the universe and the lack of free will can certainly be abused to noxious ends, and we see that all the time. But I don't think that the view itself leads to a sort of moral nihilism.
Okay. Now, one question to focus a bit on that and on an implication. Now, obviously, we said, not obviously, we said that we agree on the idea that the cure to moral fanaticism is not moral nihilism, but a sort of different moralizing attitude. So instead of, we should call out people, for instance, who apply their principles selectively and say that, well, this does not withstand scrutiny. So it seems to me that this shows a good feature of, we could say, some Western societies, that there is room for disagreement and there is room for ethical reflection and dissent. So the question is here, though, whether in treating each other as citizens who are, let's say, accountable to the force of reasons, we are treating each other as sort of beings with normative responsibilities. And would that imply a sort of presumption that we are free and morally responsible?
No, from a strictly philosophical point of view, no.
Okay.
From a cultural point of view, yes. It depends on how you use the word choice. So choice in the sense, we do have choice in the sense that we stand in front of X and Y and we do X. That's a choice. But once you add the word free choice, then of course we have to realize, well, what is meant by free choice? It's not as Hume himself would have said. Well, he waffles a bit on the question sometimes, but basically, if you do X, it means that you could only have done X. But again, most people would then say, well, so that means you're not responsible for doing X. But of course, the idea of moral responsibility existed long before the idea of free will existed. And so we still are responsible for our actions, regardless of whether we were metaphysically free to do them or not. But again, there's a reason also why I put this in the epilogue, because it's sort of it's a sort of additional philosophical consideration, if you will, for those who are interested in this topic. But it's not something that I think is very useful for society as a whole, to think of our choice and of our actions in that way.
Okay, but okay, so you do think that there is a problem, pragmatically speaking, if people start to think of themselves as not having free will?
That is a problem, pragmatically speaking, yes.
Okay, yeah. And there is another feature with that. I don't think we should focus necessarily on free will, but it seems to me that this may have been a sort of Kantian influence in philosophy, that there is always an as-if clause. We need to view the world as if we're free. We need to view the world as if we're morally responsible. We need to view the world as if it's necessitated. It seems to me that this is precisely a kind of mentality that leads people into thinking that, well, basically we're just lying to ourselves. And deep down, we think that implicitly we are lying to ourselves. And for instance, it may lead people into start thinking that maybe, well, when we are talking about morality and moral obligations, we are basically engaging in a sort of myth making, where we're trying to basically manipulate each other. Would you say that this is I think there's maybe some truth to that, but I think that's a maybe slightly uncharitable way of putting it. Because I mean, I would say, because I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to sort of, the white Platonic lie, so to speak, or the Platonic lie that we just tell people what we know is manifestly false so that they'll behave properly. Because I mean, similarly, I talk about the value of religion in society. I'm not a religious person myself in the slightest, but I talk about the importance of religion in society. So I wouldn't say that it's the sort of, we'll just tell people what they want to hear so that they'll behave. I think one can go beyond oneself and see the beauty of other traditions, and also realize that they're
and I think it maybe philosophically comes out to pretty much the same thing, but I think it's a somewhat more charitable way of putting it, namely understanding that there are several valid ways of describing the world, and that my way of describing the world has its validity, but so does a more religious worldview. It might not be one that I believe is literally true, but I can certainly believe that there is a dimension of truth to it. It depends on how literally you understand it. But so I wouldn't. People say sometimes that I'm being condescending toward religious people and so on, because I say that, well, it's, you people should believe that because it's better for society, it's better for all of us if you do. To which, of course, the answer is twofold. First of all, it doesn't matter if it's condescending or not. If it's the truth, it's the truth. And this goes back to what I said before. We're not politicians, we're philosophers. So we try to get at the truth as best we can, regardless of what people will think of it. But number two, and maybe even more importantly, I don't think it's particularly condescending, because it's not saying that there is no truth or no value to such a worldview. In fact, the people who are closest to me on a personal level are all religious people. And I used to be religious myself, actually, then abandoned faith as a teenager. But the idea that, and this is another thing, a lot of atheists try to have this very hostile view toward religion, which is not at all what I think. And I think that understanding that one can share the world, and this goes back to combating oikophobia, we can share our society with people who disagree with us, with people who feel differently, and understand, and this makes us less oikophobic if we understand that their view, our fellow citizens, their view of looking at the world might be slightly different from our own, but we understand that it as well has beauty, it as well has meaning. And if we understand that, we start to go beyond ourselves a little bit, then I would say that's a better way of looking at it.
Right. Thank you. So would you like us to end with a sort of message you want to give to people who are really concerned about oikophobia, and whether you think that there is any silver lining?
The silver lining is that we should all continue to engage in these conversations. And I'm happy to say that there is nowadays, as you know, you're a big part of it over at the Lotus Eaters, there is an entire set of alternative media now, which did not exist 30, 40 years ago. And through all of these alternative media, there is no longer a monopoly on the truth as there used to be. There are people who try to reinstate that monopoly, of course, but they haven't been successful yet. And so I tell people, continue to read, continue to listen to all different kinds of opinions, including, by the way, opinions of oikophobes, I would say. Open yourself to the full plethora of various ideas, and realize how lucky you are to live at this time and place where you have so much beauty and goodness to learn from.
Right. Excellent. Thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And I hope you really enjoyed it. Goodbye.